present at a lot of conferences where it's more humanities-based, not psychology. But in the humanities, you talk about like the ego or the self or the subject. These are all kind of used interchangeably, right? You don't do that in psychology. These terms mean very specific things. And the ego is not the same as the self, which is not the same as the subject, which is not the same as somebody's personality or somebody's psychology. These things are very different, not only in psychology as a whole, but within the different orientations inside of psychology. And so that's something to really keep in mind, right? Now, okay, how are they different? Okay, we'll get into that more as we get into the different theories. And the theories I'm going to go into, real quickly, I'm not going to give them in depth, but as to the basic question we're going into today, which is the self, I'm going to look at Freud, Jung. We're also going to look at ego psychology, okay, which is really what you guys saw in Century of the Self. The brand of psychology or psychoanalysis we're talking about in there is actually ego psychology, which is very much a U.S. product. Okay, and we'll get into that more. And then the last thing is Lacan. Okay, now before we get into that, I think a very useful way of mapping this out in our heads as we go into these four sort of orientations is to think of two different continuums. And thinking about how this would be most useful for you guys, there's two continuums. The first one actually maps out the overall orientation that the West has taken on in terms of all kinds of questions. And you can look at this all the way from science, like hard science, from chemistry or physics in particular, all the way to humanities and psychology. And it's a stance, essentially, or a continuum that goes from structuralism, and I'll talk about what that means in a second, to post-structuralism. And if you look at almost any field, you'll see, and like really any field, okay, art, what have you, you know, arts and crafts even, I mean that kind of thing. You'll see this temporal flux going from structuralism all the way to post-structuralism. Okay, what's structuralism? Well, that's actually a good question to ask now because Levi Strauss, does anybody know who that is? Yeah.
I worked there.
No, yeah, okay, there's that one, and then there's Levi Strauss, which is the theorist.
The guy that, yes, sir.
Who started the
whole, yeah, Levi Strauss.
That's actually, it's the same family, which is
yeah,
interesting. But Levi Strauss is a French theorist who he started what's called structuralism. And his idea was that like stuff that we see in the world, especially socially, okay, actually is generated from within, from sort of structures within. Or, there's another way of thinking about it, is that we are ruled by structures outside of ourselves, okay? But there's structures. But if we keep it at the level of inside the person, okay? So, I'll keep it there for now, not to get this super complex, because it can get complex, okay? So, it's more from inward to the outside, is the idea of structuralism. We have inborn structures, like for example, somebody like Chomsky is a structuralist, Noam Chomsky, the famous anarchist leftist. But before he started doing a lot of that work, did a lot of work on linguistics, and he had, like, for example, this idea of the language acquisition device. He thought of as this internal sort of capacity for us to take on language, but it's an internal thing, okay? It's not like we learn language necessarily by interacting with other people. We learn language, actually, because we have this inborn capacity. That everything else kind of adds to it in terms of relational sort of stuff in the world, that's a side issue. The main thing is it's an internal thing. So that's structuralism. Post-structuralism is the complete opposite. Post-structuralism says it's from the outside in. This is rough and rather crude, but it'll work for the purposes of what we're trying to do here. The idea with post-structuralism is that it's the relationship that counts. The relationship that counts. That's really where it's at, okay? So you see this in physics, right? Where the interaction between different types of particles, okay, are what really matters, okay, not the particles themselves. For example, the idea of, actually isolating a quark, it doesn't exist in any one single place. It's always in flux in relationship to everything else, and that's what matters. But the thing itself doesn't matter, right? And that focus on the relationship, okay, has taken over everything. It's called the relational turn. It happens in history, in the humanities, in psychology, which we'll get into in a second. It happens with everything. Okay, so it's not like I thought this whole continuum up. I mean, I'd like to say that I did, make a whole bunch of money, but that didn't happen. Okay, so a lot of people have noticed this. Okay, so you have people like Levi-Strauss, okay, both the gene maker and the theorist, okay, over here, and you have people like Foucault over here, okay. All right, Michel Foucault, the French dude, used to live in Berkeley. Okay, okay, so that's the first continuum that'll help us map out what we're going to go over today. The second one is the one in psychology. This is a different one, but what's interesting is the way it's worked out is very similar. So if we think of this as the really general way in which Western culture has oriented itself, vis-a-vis all kinds of questions and issues and themes, this is the one for psychology. It's gone from a drive-driven, there's a pun there, so you can laugh if you want to. All right. Yeah, you can laugh. I heard you guys laughing a lot in my office, so I know that you're chucklehead. That's a good thing. All right. Okay, and it's gone to a relational or intersubjective perspective, or not perspective, like general orientation. Okay, so here, the idea was that the self is formed, okay, and we'll use that because you guys are using it here. The self is actually the result of all these internal processes, right? So Freud, for example, and we'll get more into him in a second. For him, our psychology, our self, is the result of all this sort of inner turmoil and like battling, right, between the id, the ego, and the superego. Fantasies and dreams, right? But it's all sort of an internal thing. So it's drive-driven. It's all based on the drives. And drives are kind of like a weird human version of animal instincts, right? There's more of a social aspect to it, but they're still instinctual in a lot of ways. Okay, that notion that Freud had wasn't just Freud. It was most people in his era really believed in that kind of thing. Right? Okay, so over time you have this real giant shift. I mean, this is huge. That we don't see it as huge because we live in this moment. We always have lived in this moment, okay, overall. So unless you came from another culture that wasn't this, it happened to be, not because they're still stuck in the past or something, they just happen to be in a different place regarding these kind of questions, you wouldn't really understand how big of a sea change is. This is massive, this move this way. Because now the understanding is, no, it's relational, okay? It's intersubjective. It's the interaction that we have with each other, right, that produces who we are. I mean, think about that. It kind of rules everything. From education to psychology to art, everything's interactive, right? That's what matters. It's the relationship that matters. So this general way in which the West has oriented itself vis-a-vis all these questions has articulated itself in a more specific way in psychology. And so this is what we're going to be looking at. I just wanted to give you guys a sort of sense of where I'm coming from, right? It's not just my particular, bizarre version of all these kind of things. There is a lot behind it in terms of where psychology has gone. Okay, so let's try to keep these two continuums in mind as we go forward. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 orientations, okay, and how they fit on this. And then after that, we can really get into a discussion. And a lot of the way I work is, I can't believe I'm saying this, is relationally, okay? In the discussion, that's where a lot of it comes forth, right? Okay. So Freud. So Freud